It is truly unpredictable with the current global situation. Just a few days ago, following announcements from the White House regarding the postponement of attacks and signals that negotiations were proceeding favorably, Donald Trump suddenly issued a much tougher statement. The US could deploy up to 10,000 ground troops for a landing in Iran. In a normal context, such a statement would be enough to cause public alarm. But this time, the reaction was different. Many analysts raised a counter question. Could the US defeat Iran on the map but still possess the capability to survive a withdrawal? That question exposes a paradox. The US is a military superpower with overwhelming advantages in technology, firepower, and global force projection. However, Iran is not an easy swallow target. The country is viewed as a natural fortress where rugged mountainous terrain, harsh climates, and underground defense systems form a multi-layered shield that cannot be neutralized by airstrikes alone. Experts suggest that in the event of an escalating conflict, US military superiority might help them gain an initial advantage, but it does not guarantee a victory. This is because once the war shifts to the phase of occupation and control, Iran possesses the necessary conditions to turn the conflict into a prolonged war of attrition. At that point, the problem is no longer whether they can strike, but whether they can get out, a scenario that even a superpower must be wary of. If one looks closely at the map, it becomes clear why Iran is often called a perfect geographical trap. This nation is not just a territory, but a multi-tiered natural defense system. To the west, the Zagros Mountains stretch over 1,500 kilometers, consisting of parallel mountain ridges, deep valleys, and peaks reaching 3,000 to 4,000 meters. Militarily, this is not just difficult terrain, but terrain that chokes any large-scale maneuver intentions. Tanks, armored vehicles, and logistics all are squeezed into narrow corridors where even a small defensive force can turn them into deadly ambush points. It doesn't stop there. Deep inside Iran are arid plateaus and salt deserts like Dasht-e Lut or Dasht-e Kavir, areas where it is nearly impossible to sustain large forces without massive logistics. In other words, if the Zagros Mountains are the locked door, then the interior deserts are the trap that swallows any army capable of breaching that door. Notably, this entire system makes Iran a natural fortress where geography itself functions as a literal military force. This is why comparing Iran to Iraq in 2003 is a massive mistake. Iraq back then was mostly flat terrain and open desert, suitable for mechanized warfare, where the US could maximize its tank and air power to advance rapidly. Iran is the opposite. To reach the center of power, one is forced to cross the mountain ranges first before reaching the inner plateaus. This is a journey where the terrain alone is enough to wear down forces before they even meet the enemy. And this is precisely the point many get wrong. The US may control the skies and the seas, but that does not equate to controlling the outcome of the war. History has shown this clearly, from Afghanistan to Iraq. Technological superiority helps the US strike fast in the early stages, but when the war transitions to territorial control, everything becomes much more complex. With Iran, the puzzle is even harder because the country has prepared for an invasion scenario for decades. One of the key factors is the underground base system. Many of Iran's military and nuclear facilities are located dozens to hundreds of meters underground. Some are in places that even modern bunker busters would find difficult to destroy completely. This means that even if the US achieves absolute air superiority, they still cannot wipe out Iran's combat capabilities through airstrikes alone. And as long as the opponent retains the ability to counterattack, the war will drag on. From here, looking at military scenarios, the dead zones become clear. If a direct mainland landing in Iran were attempted, the first issue isn't whether they can win, but whether they have enough troops. 60,000 to 70,000 troops might sound like a lot, but compared to the scale of Iran's territory and terrain, that number is far too thin. When pulled into mountain desert terrain warfare, this force risks being scattered, losing coordination, and gradually being depleted. The second scenario is seizing Karg Island, the heart of Iran's oil exports. This sounds like striking the vital point, but in reality, it is a trap. To approach Karg, the US Navy must pass through narrow waters, vulnerable to attacks from missiles, sea mines, and small crafts. Even if the island is captured, holding and resupplying the forces there would be a major problem. A base surrounded by sea, sitting right next to the enemy's mainland, is essentially a fixed target. The third scenario, occupying small islands like Larak or Abu Musa, is even more difficult. These targets can be taken quickly but are nearly impossible to hold long term. They have small surface areas, no defensive depth, and are within direct firing range of the Iranian mainland. In other words, landing troops there is no different from putting them in a cage in the middle of the sea. Therefore, the most theoretically feasible option is a feint, using landing forces as a distraction while conducting precision strikes on strategic targets. But even this scenario is fraught with risk, as it depends almost entirely on intelligence and the element of surprise. Just one wrong step and the entire campaign could collapse. In summary, the problem for the US, if it attacks Iran, does not lie in whether they can strike, but how they will leave after the strike. Because when geography, logistics, and the opponent's defensive strategy converge, war is no longer just a battle. It becomes a labyrinth where the deeper one goes, the smaller the chance of escape becomes. If we set aside all factors of terrain or tactics, there is still one thing that determines survival in any war: logistics. To put it bluntly, modern warfare is not just about bombs or technology, it is a logistics puzzle. Whoever feeds their troops better has the chance to win in the long run. And this is exactly where an attack scenario on Iran becomes extremely risky for the US. The US is strongest when it has secure bases, airfields, seaports, and a stable supply chain from the rear. But if hostilities spread around the Persian Gulf region, especially at the Strait of Hormuz, that entire system begins to shake. Iran doesn't need to confront US forces head-on, they only need to strike the supply lines, fuel tankers, logistics ships, and forward bases. Simply by disrupting the logistical flow, US vanguard forces, no matter how elite, will be eroded over time. The issue is that, unlike Iraq or Afghanistan, the US does not have an absolutely safe rear if a conflict with Iran escalates. Regional bases in Qatar, Bahrain, or the UAE are all within range of Iranian missiles. This means logistics is no longer a one-way street from back to front, but a target under constant threat. When logistics are placed in a state of danger, every offensive operation carries a much higher price tag. And when the war touches the Strait of Hormuz, the story is no longer just between two nations. This is the transit route for approximately 20% of the global oil supply. If this area is disrupted, oil prices could skyrocket in a very short time. Scenarios mentioned in energy reports suggest oil prices could easily exceed $150 or even $200 per barrel if the conflict persists. At that point, the impact won't stop at energy markets, but will spread to the entire global economy. Inflation will rise, transport costs will spike, and supply chains will be strangled. Economies dependent on energy imports will suffer a direct shock, while oil exporting countries won't necessarily be winners either, as high market volatility brings financial instability. In that context, the petrodollar system, tightly linked to oil trading in USD, would also face pressure. If oil flows are disrupted or diverted to other payment mechanisms, the position of the USD in global energy trade could be shaken. In other words, a war with Iran is not just a military campaign, it is a geopolitical shock with the potential to go global. That is why many analysts believe the greatest risk is not whether the US has the strength to attack, but the price to be paid afterward. Returning to the original question, the US is fully capable of launching an attack on Iran. Almost no one doubts that. But in war, the attack is only the first step. The problem is, capturing a target does not guarantee holding it, and holding it does not guarantee being able to withdraw on one's own terms. When the terrain is unfavorable, logistics are threatened, and the opponent still has the capacity to counterattack, every military campaign risks turning into an endless war of attrition. In the case of Iran, the trap lies not only on the ground, but within the very structure of the war itself, where every step forward brings greater consequences. Therefore, the final assessment perhaps does not lie in which side is stronger, but in which side can endure longer. Looking at it from that perspective, a landing in Iran is not merely starting a war. It is like entering a labyrinth, where the further you go, the more the exit fades, and the cost of turning back could be far greater than initially imagined.